At this time, I'd like to introduce today's featured presenter, Dr. Charles Webster. Charles, or Chuck as he's often called, is a prolific thought leader in the health IT community. He was listed as one of the top 10 HIT bloggers to follow on Twitter by Healthcare IT News, and was a top influencer in social media at this year's HIMSS conference. You can follow him on Twitter at EHRWorkflow, or you can read his blog at chuckwebster.com. With degrees in accountancy, industrial engineering, computational linguistics, artificial intelligence, and medicine, Dr. Webster has unique insights into how healthcare can be improved. He's noted for designing the first undergraduate program in medical informatics and for writing the first 3 award-winning case studies submitted for the HIMSS Davies Award for EHR Ambulatory Excellence. Chuck is a strong proponent for BPM and workflow solutions, and today he'll be sharing his insights about those technologies and how they can be used in a healthcare environment. So Chuck, at this time, I'd like to turn the presentation over to you.
And thank you. I see my slides. Excellent. Well, thank you for that introduction. Are you hearing me at that end, and I presume out there as well?
That sounds great.
Great. Good introduction, and thank you to everybody who's attending this session called The Power of Process, Workflow Automation, Business Process Management, and Healthcare. I'll give a little background. I will argue that healthcare needs business process management. I will compare healthcare to other industries. I will look at a couple of use cases, both at the point of care, not at the point of care, and then I'll talk about next steps after the webinar. I could read my bio, but it'd be really boring, so I'm going to just say it is boring, but a Venn diagram, especially a colorful one, is more interesting. So I've got these 4 degrees. I was pre-med accountancy major, eventually went to medical school. I also have masters in industrial engineering and artificial intelligence with some focus in computational linguistics and cognitive science. Okay, I have a bunch of websites, a bunch of content out there, mostly educational nature and news. I'm trying to build a community of people who are interested in what the academics call process-aware information systems that actually represent and understand and reason and can improve processes automatically or semi-automatically. You've probably seen this big wave, and you've heard the phrase big data. This is actually an animation. It's a series of slides, so it's not quite as smooth, but you can imagine that wave is moving, and I will argue that close on the heels of big data is something I call big workflow. Now, what do I mean by big workflow? Well, about 10 years ago, I wrote a white paper on healthcare workflow that's been #1 in Google at the top of the first page almost for 10 years. And I used a phrase there, which is the workflow of workflow. Well, if you ever think of data about data, that's metadata. Thinking about thinking, that's metacognition. Well, workflow about workflow is meta workflow, but I like workflow of workflow better as a phrase. So let's start with the definition of workflow. I've looked at hundreds, and this is my distilled definition. It is simply a series of steps consuming resources that achieve a goal. I've seen simpler definitions, like series of steps, and I have seen many much more complicated definitions, but we're going to work with this one. Here's a visual representation of workflow. We have a series of states, transitions between those states. That's a workflow, and that achieves the goal of whatever. Now, let's think about improving that workflow. Well, that's a workflow too. The workflow of workflow is improving workflow. So to get from workflow to better workflow and to even better workflow is a series of steps. And obviously one wants to create a virtuous cycle in which you're improving all aspects of workflow, both reducing errors, reducing variability, increasing speed, reducing cycle time, the amount of time it takes to get from the beginning to an end of a workflow. And if you do that, you usually can increase volume of transactions, and you're trying to hit that goal, hit that target, and do it with the least amount of resources. My wife, right about now, says, Chuck, cat, dog, tree. It's all very zen. I realized after a while what she meant was, what is the simplest set of simple ideas that can only fit together in one way that achieves my goal or it communicates my point. And so I'm going to try to cat, dog, tree workflow and the workflow. And I kind of like the way the question marks are over this dog because he's wondering how things are going to turn out. Well, I think most of us stereotypically would know that this is the way it's going to turn out. The cat's up the tree, the dog's at the base of the tree. Well, I'm going to turn cat, dog, tree into a verb, and I'm going to cat, dog, tree workflow. Engine, that's what the thing that does the work. In the real world, this is a Corvette engine. It does a lot of physical work. In the software world, workflow engines do work for users. They do digital work. Well, how do they know what to do? How do they know which task to hand to which person or which data to download from which database automatically without requiring anybody to click on anything? Well, they follow a definition, a workflow definition. Down at the bottom here, we have the definition of definitions, speaking of meta. This is from the 1755 Dictionary of the English Language. It was the first one of a comprehensive nature by Samuel Johnson, and he described the definition as a short description of a thing by its properties. Well, you can describe workflow as a list of steps and a list of resources that are consumed and a goal that is achieved. Well, where does that definition come from? It comes traditionally from a human, someone who understands the work domain. Here we have the harried editor, and that person understands the domain. They create this process model, a model of the workflow, and then that is fed to the machine, to the engine, to execute. While it is being executed, things are being tweaked. You're observing, you're adjusting the carburetor. If it runs out of gas, you put gas in. So there's a kind of a real-time management of the workflow system as well. Well, what that definition is, and this is an actual simplified definition of a patient encounter. So here we have a set of screens. The screens are popping up automatically, and a nurse is going to collect some vitals information, enter that into a screen either by touching things or using speech recognition. And then there's a sequence of screens to, are you on any new meds recently? Should I take any off the list? How about allergies? What are you allergic to? And then down here in the blue roll, we have a physician may conduct several steps, such as doing an exam and then making an assessment and ordering some treatment, such as a prescription that will be sent someplace. And then there's this iterative set down here in which you try to get the money from the insurance company. Well, someone who understands the patient encounter can model that, can create a description of it. And that can be executed by the workflow engine, putting the right screens in front of the right person so that they don't have to click a lot. A lot of folks complain about clickaria, by analogy to diarrhea, too much clicking. Plus, it can accomplish things automatically in the background, saving a lot of time. And of course, it's consistent because it's a computer. But the really cool thing from the point of view of meta workflow, the workflow of workflow, big workflow, is while that engine is working, it is generating immense amounts of time-stamped data. So up here at the top, we see that 85% of the time, the nurse, and I'm going to bring up my little cursor here. Yeah, 85% of the time, the nurse chooses to go collect meds and allergy through the template. But 15% of the time, she goes over and uses speech recognition to generate a note. And then down here, it converges. You can use this information along with the time of 8 minutes between vitals and the note to spot bottlenecks and go and ask the nurse, well, why did you take so long and why did you do it this way? And she can explain, and you can then change the workflow. Okay, that's workflow. Well, what is business process management? Well, the BPM industry evolved out of the workflow management systems industry, and for a long time people said, oh, that's just old wine in new bottles. It's workflow with a whole bunch of adjectives like transparent, agile, that sort of thing. But in fact, the way I think of it is that harried human editor, how about you give that human all kinds of great tools to improve the workflow, either after the fact or to monitor the workflow. That's called business activity monitoring. And by the way, that computer right there, that's the Altair 8800. It is the first PC. It ignited the PC revolution, and it was invented and developed and sold by a pediatrician. I just love to find those connections between the IT and the medical side. Okay, back to workflow of workflow. If you look up business process management in Wikipedia, there's a phrase there, which is process optimization process. Again, it sounds meta. The process of optimizing a process. It kind of should remind you of that diagram I showed you of the workflow of workflow, the steps between bad workflow to good workflow. Well, business process management has a life cycle. Here we have design, model, execute, monitor, optimize. Should be similar to what I just described. Design and model, that's creating the process definition, the process model. Execute it, that's what the workflow engine or the orchestration engine or the process engine does. Those are approximate synonyms. Then you've got monitoring. So while it's executing, if there's an exception, if it falls off the happy path, you want a human to intercede and fix the problem. And then optimization. All this data that gets generated can be fed back into reducing cycle time, increasing throughput, decreasing errors, increasing the accuracy with which the goal is achieved, and achieving the same amount of work with fewer resources. If that cycle reminds you of something called PDCA, plan, do, check, act, or adjust, it should. It's software-based PDCA. So much of work today in healthcare is being mediated. It's actually in the software. And so if you want to improve that work and that workflow, why not use the software to do it? This is the last non-healthcare slide. Just to give you a sense of perspective, the global BPM market is about $3 billion, and it's heading to about $7 billion over the next 4 years, and it's growing at about 18% a year. Just to give you a sense of perspective, the health IT market is about a magnitude greater, about 8 to 12 or 13 times as big, depending on which year you are looking at in this projection, and it's growing at a rate of about 7%. I strongly believe, and I have been arguing for a decade, with increasing success, mind you, that healthcare needs business process management. Why? The IOM, Institute of Medicine, estimates that the U.S. wastes more than $760 billion a year, 1/3 of the total $2.5+ trillion healthcare economy. So I recently went out, that's the next slide. Why does the IOM think that this is the problem? What's causing this waste? Unnecessary services, medical errors, uncoordinated care, excessive variation, fraud. There's a great variety here, such a variety. What do all of these have in common? They all have in common workflow. They are complicated workflows, complicated processes, complicated series of steps consuming resources and achieving goals, or maybe in some cases not achieving goals. If we modeled more of those, and we executed those models, and we generated the big data necessary to improve those workflows, we could go a long way to reduce the amount of waste in healthcare. So I went and I found the world's expert on workflow technology. He's Will Vanderals. He's in the Netherlands. He's written over 200 papers, chapters, 3 or 4 books, and about 20 or 30 of his articles are about healthcare. He's very interested in healthcare, and he estimates, back of the envelope calculation, mind you, that the U.S. could save as much as $600 billion if we fully adopted process-aware information technology, which is what the academics call business process management. I think it's worth reading this quote. We, the BPM researchers, have a particular interest in healthcare because processes are much more chaotic than in other industries, and potential savings are enormous. Healthcare is very challenging, and therefore a very interesting application domain. All right, slight change of gear. If you're in health IT, you know that doctors are complaining about EHR usability. Here are some example headlines. Satisfaction is falling. Usability is a bigger issue. We need more user-friendly EHRs. We've got a long way to go. And editorials that vendors must solve these usability issues. Well, guess what? These usability issues of EHRs is just the tip of the iceberg. Both EHRs and non-EHR health IT systems have massive problems with effectiveness, efficiency, and user satisfaction. What's so interesting about those three qualities is they are the International Standards Organization's definition of usability. Usable products and services are effective, efficient, and they make their users, whether they're someone clicking on a screen or a patient someplace, happy. Compare that definition to a definition of business process management. It is a systematic approach to making an organization's workflow more effective, more efficient, and more capable of adapting to an ever-changing environment. Effectiveness, effective. Efficiency, efficient. User satisfaction. I would argue that the single biggest problem with user dissatisfaction with current health IT systems is that they are not capable of adapting and customizing workflow to their local preferences and needs, and to do so over time, to change as the regulatory environment and as the business needs change. Now, I imagine we may have some healthcare process improvement folks out there. And so what is the relationship between BPM and healthcare process improvement? Back when I got my master's in industrial engineering, the management engineers that worked in hospitals and elsewhere, they were involved in both sides of an equation. They were creating and implementing many of the first information systems. I worked in a hospital MIS department where the payroll system had been developed and implemented and managed by a management engineer, an industrial engineer. But then what happened is a bunch of folks went off and they started developing electronic health records and other health IT systems, and you've got this research behind it, which is medical informatics. And I don't think they spent enough energy and time thinking about workflow problems and workflow theories and creating workflow tools. Meanwhile, over on the other side, we've got the total quality management folks, Six Sigma and Lean. They're finding the causes of errors. They're finding the sources of variation and eliminating it. They're figuring out how to do the same amount of work but with less waste. Well, the problem is that more and more work is actually done in a kind of a mind meld with the software. And so we really need to knit together these two traditions. And I think that the healthcare business process management hybrid is a way to do that. I go to many health IT and business process management conferences, and I have seen many impressive case studies. Insurance, banking, manufacturing, energy, hospitality, transportation, trade associations. Where's healthcare? Well, until recently, it's not been present a lot, but it is showing up, and those case studies are very impressive. I've written about them, and I have descriptions of a variety on my blog. And healthcare is catching up. So there was a survey recently of IT professionals asking which vertical they were in, which industry they were in, and whether they were using business process management or not. 6% in healthcare were using BPM. Most of these systems are in the back room. They're used for human resources and for healthcare insurance, but that's moving out of the back room as people see the potential for this kind of technology closer and closer to the point of care. And in fact, almost 20% plan future investment, and I think that percentage is actually going to be much higher. Okay, healthcare. Healthcare is like a very large insular country that's been closed off from the rest of the world for a long time, but now it's opening up. And the same forces that are affecting many other verticals, such as social, mobile, analytics, and cloud, particularly, are also affecting healthcare. These technologies and these new industries, if you look under the hood, often the most successful platforms have workflow automation, workflow engines, the ability to draw out a workflow or to systematically improve that workflow with data, possibly big data. And that is essentially kind of like an epidemiological vector. It is bringing into healthcare workflow automation, which is not to say that workflow automation hasn't always existed in healthcare. However, it's not been widely prevalent or appreciated or understood. But I think the profile is dramatically rising because of this confluence of these internally developed workflow automation systems and the ones that are being brought in by the social, mobile, and analytics cloud platforms. So, point-of-care workflow automation. Let's look at a use case. What is a use case? Well, in Wiki, it says a use case is a list of steps defining interactions between a role, such as a physician or a nurse or someone in the health records department, and a system, such as an information system, to achieve a goal. That sounds kind of familiar to me. Sounds a lot like my definition. A workflow is a series of steps, consuming resources, which I think is implied by the use case, to achieve a goal. The difference is the use case is a list of steps, whereas workflow is the steps themselves. Well, what about a workflow definition? A definition is a short description of a thing by its properties. The most essential definition of workflow is the list of steps. So a use case and a workflow definition are approximately similar to each other, and that's part of the secret to the sauce. The fact that a use case could be a drawing of stick figures interacting with a system over time, or a pseudo-English description, but it's also a workflow definition which can be executed and improved by a computer. Here's a classic-looking workflow editor. If you've ever used Visio from Microsoft, it looks kind of familiar. I've drawn this kind of thing. I've been in a boardroom where all four walls were covered by butcher paper, and it was covered with Sharpie pen-written workflows. The problem with those kinds of workflows is after you have it, you have a pretty picture, but you can't turn around, turn a crank, and turn it into a computer program. Now, in this case, just to ground it a little bit on the clinical side, we've got a patient coming in, and they have had a possible cerebrovascular accident. And these decision points, the little yellow diagonals, are decisions that have to be made. Should we check the neurological status? Is this a thrombolysis candidate? Have we confirmed that there was an accident? What about hemorrhage? And then a decision. And these little icons here, nurse, physician, and so forth, are dragged and dropped to create it. Now, I want to compare that classic workflow editor with a simpler workflow editor. In this scene, it doesn't look that simple, but it will look simpler in a moment. You can think of a health information system, or in this case, an electronic health record, as a set of screens, but also the little dotted lines, those are screenless tasks. And these screens allow users to review data from previous patient encounters, to enter more data that will be useful in making decisions at later points, as well as order entry screens in which assessments and diagnoses and treatments, such as things that will send prescriptions off through SureScripts are. Now, the screenless tasks are also saving a lot of time and effort and money and user dissatisfaction. They're automatically going to see if there are clinical labs and downloading them and then putting a list, an item in a work list. They're printing educational materials at the printer that's closest to the person who's responsible for the patient. They're creating automatic reminders based on schedules interacting with business rules or clinical decision rules. So that obviously saves a lot of time and effort. Well, where did it come from, this workflow that I'm talking about? Well, we're going to grab a bunch of those, and we're going to create a workflow. Over on the left-hand side, we have, it's only 8 steps. A typical encounter might be 20 steps, but we will see what these are because we can look at the pick list that represents the workflow. We have get patient, so the nurse walks into the room, says, I am bringing John Doe into room C, and then the next couple of screens pop up automatically. The nurse doesn't have to go and navigate some complicated and clumsy menu hierarchy. We're going to collect some vital signs, ask about allergies, ask about medications. We're going to conduct a review of systems, and that review of systems will be the right one based on whether it's a child or an adult, whether that nurse has a favorite review of systems, or it may be based on the physician that nurse works for, and different specialists have different review of systems. And so these systems can be very parameterized so that at each point of step in execution, they do the right thing. And so finally, you get down to the billing steps. And I will skip ahead. By the way, there's something I call the litmus test for frozen workflow. After you see the demo of a system, say, I'd like to see that demo again, except I want you to make one change. I want you to bring up something that will allow you to edit the workflow. It might look like that old-fashioned workflow editor with all the, the arrows and diagonal boxes, or it might look like this, or it might look like something else. And what I want you to do is go in there and change one thing. Delete a step, change the order of a step, and then I want you to go and do the demo again. And if that system has an actual workflow engine that is consulting some kind of representation of workflow, it will do what you would expect it would do if it's executing that recently edited model. So in this case, it should skip the step of checking for allergies, asking the nurse, ask the patient about allergies. Okay, let's look at a non-point of care workflow automation example. Here is a drag and drop hospital workflow definition editor, and up here at the top is the beginning of the workflow, down at the bottom is the end. This kind of is like a cross between those two previous ones that we just looked at. And it's going to be, okay, we want to drag and drop, we want to create a step, which is to go and get a signature from someone. And then when that happens, we want to forward it to a role or a group. So anybody can look on this list of available tasks. It's kind of a pooling concept from computers, and grab it and say, yes, quality assurance, everything has been done that I think should be done. And then even the manager gets this. We have two levels of quality assurance. So everything goes through the manager. And then finally, we see down here, there's like a little icon of a person and an arrow and going back to a question mark. We want to close the loop. We want to send back information to the person who ordered this workflow to say it was successfully accomplished. But this is just a skeleton of a workflow. We want to go in and customize these steps further. So let's say we want to go to the manager step and we want to give them an option to add a little note. So we've got the little pen symbol. Now suppose we want to make sure that every time that happens, an email gets sent to maybe this is not the ultimate manager. Maybe they're filling in for someone, or it needs to be copied to the other people who are also have managing roles that are rotating through this department. Well, now we have the executable process model. It's a process model. It's a process definition. It's a workflow definition. I'm using these so you get familiar with the terminology, which can vary. And then the workflow engine looks at it and says, okay, I need to send a to-do item to this person. When they click on it, it's going to pull up this form. It might be on a tablet as they're wandering around the hospital. Then I want to forward the results of that into some pool where other people will grab it and do something with it. It needs, ultimately, everything, the manager has to sign off on everything because in this place they have two levels of quality assurance. And finally, we want whoever initiated this needs to know that it was done. So we're closing the loop. All right. Now, don't have enough time. This is a cat dog tree version of business process management. But I did want to pull out an example number from a case study, and so there was a paper manual process for generating the patient admissions packet in a hospital. It cost $2.40, it was estimated. And then after the workflow was automated using a workflow engine and process definition and so forth, the cost per packet dropped to 45 cents. This is on the order of increase in productivity of 300 or 400%. I've seen this before. And what's fascinating is I have seen many manual paper processes automated that did not use workflow automation, did not use true workflow automation with the workflow engine doing all that work. And guess what? Those end up reducing productivity. People have to click a lot because if there is no workflow engine in the computer, the human has to do all that work, and they got to click, 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 and they complain about that. Other things, the other dimensions of increased productivity are things like if you greatly reduce the cycle time. So if all the steps are not having to wait around for someone to pick up the baton and move it to the next person, well, it's going to happen more quickly. And so when you get a shorter cycle time, you get higher throughput. And for the given amount of resources, you're going to be able to scale up, or you're going to be able to achieve the same amount with reduced resources. All right. if my enthusiasm and my animations and this data has convinced you, maybe I ought to investigate this further, this is my workflow of where to go. You might call it meta-meta workflow, the workflow of workflow of workflow. And so we're learning right now. That's what we're doing right here. Well, this is called a split, by the way, and so both of these happen in parallel. And you look at your environment and you say, well, what are the high-value workflows? What are the things, and on the next slide we'll talk about what is a high-value workflow. And those workflows, the details about those workflows will inform you about a set of requirements so that you can compare workflow products or workflow platforms or vendors. Let's look at workflow value. Workflow value is a function of a number of users. The more users that use it, well, then the more valuable it's going to be. More happy people, the greatest good for the greatest many. The more frequently the workflow is executed, the more value it will be. If it's executed every 15 minutes, it's going to be a lot more valuable than if it's executed every couple of weeks. The financial value is important. Is there something writing a check at the end of the successful workflow? And then finally, the difference between a better workflow and the current painful workflow, the current ineffective, inefficient, and unhappy user workflow, the bigger that is, the more the workflow value is going to be. Okay, well, once you've done that, you need to winnow down those workflows a little bit further. And what you need to do, because you need to walk before you run, you need to say, well, what are the low complexity workflows? What are the workflows that would be easiest to accomplish? Because a lot of people are going to be watching, and you want to plan for success. And so you want to do the thing that is going to give you the biggest bang for the buck, and then people are going to line up because of the latent demand for fixing workflow problems. What is workflow complexity? It is also the number of users, because users are different. So you have a lot of users, and they're all different. Well, guess what? That causes complexity. Now you've got the number of steps. The more steps that you have to model and to execute, the more complicated the workflow definition, the more complicated the executable process model will be. The more other systems that the system has to touch, the emails that need to be sent automatically, the data that needs to be downloaded from a clinical laboratory, or the prescription that needs to be sent someplace, or the database in the medical records department that has patient demographics and forms content, the more complicated the workflow is going to be. And then finally, the more logically complex the decision-making and the problem-solving across that workflow, the more complicated the workflow. So the simpler the decision-making, the more likely you can create an if-then rule someplace, some business rule. The more complicated, the more you're going to require human intervention, and that equals complexity. Okay, so you scan your environment and you say, here's all the workflows. You grade them according to high value versus low value, low complexity versus high complexity. And while you probably don't want to bother with low value anything, low value, low complexity, low value, certainly not low value, high complexity, but you want to start with a success because people are watching. And so you choose that, and when you're successful, you then start to move up into more complex but also higher value. And now we finally made it down to, actually tackling that workflow. Well, where is the knowledge that is going to make you successful? Well, business process management, especially in healthcare, and workflow automation, workflow management systems technology, case management systems, the terminology hasn't yet been standardized, and the best practices have not been standardized. And so you kind of need to go native with the vendor. The vendor has a track record of success. They know what works. They're invested in your success. And so you need to, spend the amount of time they think you need to spend on training and so forth and so on. In a sense, you got to pick the right Kool-Aid, and then you got to drink that Kool-Aid. You kind of got to go native in order to bring the workflow mindset, the workflow culture from the vendor over into your organization. Okay, we're closing here, and I just want to show that big data slide. We've got this wave, and it's in the headlines. But I am firmly convinced that even more important than big data is big workflow. And big workflow requires big data. It requires the data necessary to systematically improve workflow based on analytics that are hooked to things like cycle time, throughput, patient safety, and so forth and so on. And I'm very, very cheerful and optimistic about more and more of this kind of technology: workflow engines, process definitions, workflow management systems, workflow automation, business process management, case management. These are all kind of mixed together in amalgam. I call it healthcare business process management. Now, some people have a problem with the word business in healthcare, and so you'll also sometimes see healthcare process management or care process management. But if you drill down and you look in the footnotes, you'll typically see workflow engines, models, executable models of work. And I've created a website at HCBPM, healthcarebusinessprocessmanagement.com. Hope you'll stop by. I've got lots of content there and links off to case studies and so forth. One more thing. I love hearing workflow success stories, regardless of whether they involve workflow engines or not. And so I've created a directory on my Twitter account's website, which is at ehrworkflow.com, POWHIT, P-O-W-H-I-T. The link's on the next slide too. POWHIT, that stands for People and Organizations Improving Workflow with Health Information Technology. POWHIT is kind of like those call-outs that you'd see during a fisticuff scene in the old Batman series, just trying to give it a little zip. Okay, finally, we've come to the end here. I think we'll probably be holding questions until after Sean has his chance to present. I do want to mention, again, my blog, chuckwebster.com, my Twitter account. I think I'm pretty interactive. And I want to thank the folks down here at the bottom, Brown Selassie, who I believe is in the Middle East or Africa, Professor BPM in the Netherlands, Lucas Ryan, M. Luxton's a great guy. You should follow him. I'll list these. Maybe I'll tweet them out. But they've been retweeting links about this seminar, and they've been tweeting me and saying, how are the slides coming along? And it's a very jovial community, and it's a good community to join if you want to learn about this kind of stuff. So that's it.
And it is, who needs to be the champion of workflow? Is it the physician, the nurse, administration, IT? What's your thought?
Well, my thought is, often when folks want to implement an electronic health record, they say, well, we need a champion, and so that internal champion. I'm not even sure that the idea of a workflow champion necessarily makes sense to me. I think that if you give people the tools to improve the workflow around them, they will tend to want to do it, especially if you can demonstrate to them. So I guess you do need a champion for that sort of first, the high value. Whoever owns the high value, low complexity workflow, that's the champion. In fact, I didn't show all of the dimensions. There's actually about 3 or 4 dimensions to both value and complexity. And one of the values, one of the dimensions had to do with executive sponsorship and or a champion. So there it's a little bit like looking for your keys under the lamp light post, because that's where you can see. So as you scan the environment, you're going to, one of the 3 or 4 or 5 things that will determine whether a workflow is a high-value workflow or not is whether there's a natural champion who can help shepherd. So it's going to be on a case-by-case basis.
Great. And as a follow-up to that, are there specific examples of those high-value, low-complexity workflows that you can think of as low-hanging fruits in the hospital?
Well, I'm going to actually, it tends to be very, very, sort of domain specific. You were talking about the medical records department. Are we talking about, ambulatory? Are we talking about, managing some kind of process in the executive suite? So probably good specific examples. In this case, Sean might be the best source.
Yeah, we typically talk with our customers, about their high volume forms, and there are a lot of things that aren't that complex, and a lot of the processes don't have a definition around them today, even. So things like employee onboarding and all the things that are spurred around that, requesting access to systems from IT, requesting security badges and clearances from the security department. So as you onboard an employee, those are simple processes, but maybe you don't have full control over those. And then kind of the other side of this too is, what's the impact of not having full control over these processes? So when that employee terminates, do you know what systems they have access to? Do you know what security passes they have on them? Do you know what equipment has been issued to them? So being able to take those processes from the simple aspect of, geez, we just hired somebody, they need these items, and then turning that into, now we have an inventory of what every employee has, and extending it, because now we can leverage technology rather than trap knowledge to do that. Another high volume application that a lot of our customers are using are employee change orders. So when they transfer from department to department or change a rate or hours, those are very high volume transactions in those processes, especially in some of the larger organizations. There are a lot of employees to deal with. There are all kinds of processes that can be automated, and of course the number one process would be admissions, generating the right content at the time of admissions and making sure you get that right so that patient care flows properly and so that billing flows properly. It affects a lot of things, getting that right, getting signatures in place. So that's one of the core processes of automation that's a low-hanging fruit as well.
Great. Another question that we got via the chat states, how would you manage the quote-unquote "but we're special" pushback most BPM theory gets from clinical care teams? Chuck, do you see that type of pushback?
Yes, I do, and I think, and again, you only have enough time to cover what you can cover, and I think I was pretty organized and spoke pretty quickly. But if you go back to, I think, can you put me back on the first slide, or on my slides?
Sure thing, just one moment.
And yes, okay, so I'm going to go back to, I said I wasn't going to be boring, but here I guess I will. Okay. Within...
what slide are you on, Chuck?
I'm on slide 8.
Okay.
Do you see it?
Yeah, we're seeing that now.
Okay. The fifth one down, Adaptive Case Management, Global Excellence Awards. I'm actually a judge on that. Within the business process management community, and forget, you saw the quote from Will Vanderels in which he said that healthcare is more chaotic and more unstructured. Within the business process management community, there's been a similar reaction to overly rigid process models, and part of the the tribe of rebels, they they're into something they call adaptive case management. Adaptive case management, and these systems, they come out of the business process management community, but they very much diminish emphasis on that, that network diagram that says this has to happen, then this has to happen. In fact, what they do is they represent very high-level goals, like this case is 25% done, or we have obtained the signature. It doesn't say how to get the signature. Anybody can get the signature, but what they do emphasize is visibility. Visibility, here are the set of goals. Anybody can accomplish it based on certain constraints. I mean, you have to have the authority and so forth. And then everybody sees, as the case moves along, what's being accomplished, and then people jump in more dynamically. What these systems emphasize and represent is what needs to be done, not how it needs to be done. And so there are some very interesting adaptive case management systems that I think would be great in some of the more, well, they'd be great to show to those folks who look at a traditional BPM system and look at that workflow and say, well, we can't imagine ourselves fitting ourselves into such a rigid, structured workflow.
Perfect. Another question from Vince, who notes your presentation seems to focus mostly on workflow within organizations, and he notes that he agrees about a lot of challenges and opportunities there. He'd also like for you to comment on the similarities and differences of BPM within organizations versus across organizations.
Okay, yes. I'm interested in workflow across organizations. And there are interesting, in fact, integration engines and interface engines that allow various kinds of messages to be passed through from organization to organization have a lot of business process management-like qualities. And a lot of BPM engines also have adapters that allow them to transform and transport messages. So there's actually a lot of overlap. I focused kind of on the workflow within the organization, partly because I don't think you can have great workflow between organizations if the organizations themselves don't have great workflow inside. I don't think you can build a strong bridge out of mediocre materials. That's just a personal axe I have to grind. But there are lots of orchestration engines out there in healthcare that have business process management-like characteristics. And so I do see a kind of a great convergence of rose by any other name, as long as it models the process, and whether it's inside the organization or outside the organization, if it provides transparency, scalability, flexibility, that's great.
Segueing on the topic of integration, Matthew would like to know, how do we use this in inpatient flow management when the applications like ER systems, bed management systems, and utilization management systems are all unintegrated?
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that. I've worked in a hospital MIS department, and we did an environmental scan, and we ended up with, several hundred information systems, and this was 20 years ago. And none of them talk to any of them. And now some of them talk to each other. I guess there's some progress there. I think that one of the measures of complexity in ranking workflows was how many systems does it touch or need to integrate with. And if it needs to integrate with a bunch of systems, or it needs to integrate with a system that you cannot integrate with, that makes it highly complex. And I think you need to start with the workflows that can be successful. Because if they're successful and people understand the benefits of a process-aware philosophy and of using workflow engines and so forth, then that's going to put pressure to open up other systems so they can participate in this larger workflow highway that's being created. I know that doesn't really address a particular system, but it does give you a route forward to sort of strategically bring in more true workflow automation into a hospital environment.
Okay, and Casey comments that lean was a big topic of discussion at the recent HM13 conference. She wants to know if you see lean as a good first pass for healthcare entities looking to explore BPM.
When I look at the old days, TQM, Six Sigma, finding errors and eliminating variability, and lean particularly. In fact, I have a link on one. I used to give a 3-hour tutorial on workflow automation in healthcare at the old Tepper conference, which is gone. I did that for 3 or 4 years running, and I have a blog. I turn those into blog posts. I actually have a blog post. If you'll leave me a comment or contact me through the contact form, in which I talk about non-value-added versus value-added activities in a workflow automation context. And I think that if you give the lean professionals and the Six Sigma professionals, you give them the kind of plastic, instrumented, malleable healthcare workflow information management tools, I think you're going to turbocharge and give a great deal of help to those Lean and Six Sigma activities. In fact, the BPM professionals, they don't necessarily know the healthcare domain that well. They and a very nice marriage of healthcare domain content expertise is the Lean and Six Sigma health professional in conjoined with these tools that increasingly mediate information flow and therefore work.
Perfect. And I realize that we are a bit over time today, so that will conclude the question and answer portion of the session. If we didn't get to your question, we'll reach out to you individually offline and answer your question then.
And I'd like to thank everybody who attended, but especially everybody who I interact with on Twitter. And if you're not on Twitter, come and get and interact, because it's a fun community and a great way to learn about this stuff.
And I'd like to thank our featured speaker, Dr. Charles Webster, for sharing his thoughts on workflow. Thanks, Chuck, for presenting today.
Have a great day, everybody.
And thanks to Sean Curtis as well for taking the time out of his schedule to join us. We hope that this session has been educational and has also inspired you to learn more about using workflow in your hospital. If that's the case, we'd like to hear from you. You'll be presented with a response page at the conclusion of this event. Simply click on the button on the screen to schedule a consultation with us, and make sure to register for the next web event as well. The next web session will actually be our 2013 user group meeting at the end of June. We'll be featuring customer success stories, new product and feature announcements, tips and tricks for better using our solutions, and more. The virtual conference will be divided into 2 days, and you can register for that on the response page or by visiting www.formfast.com/UGM for user group meeting. Thank you for attending today's webinar, and we'll see you at the user group meeting at the end of June.